The Celts, iron, magic, and the soul of Europe. Before Rome, before the Germanic tribes, before any of the civilizations that shaped the Europe we know today, there was a people who stretched from Turkey to Ireland, a culture so vast, so fierce, and so deeply rooted in the land that even after 2,000 years of conquest, assimilation, and deliberate suppression, their languages are still spoken, their festivals are still celebrated, and their art is still instantly recognizable anywhere in the world. They had no emperor, no single capital city, no written records, and yet they produced some of the most breathtaking metalwork in human history. They were the Celts. So how did one culture come to dominate half a continent? And why does so much of what they built still haunt us today? High in the Austrian Alps, in a narrow valley above a lake so still it mirrors the mountains surrounding it, there is a village called Hallstatt. Its name comes from the ancient Germanic words for salt and place. And salt is exactly what made this remote alpine village one of the most important sites in the story of European civilization. Because beneath the mountain above Hallstatt, and in dozens of similar mines across the alpine region, the people archaeologists now call the Hallstatt culture were extracting, processing, and trading salt in quantities that would have seemed extraordinary to the agricultural communities of the surrounding lowlands. And in doing so, they were building the economic foundation of the civilization we call Celtic. Salt in the ancient world was not a condiment. It was a technology, the primary means of food preservation available before refrigeration, the substance that allowed meat and fish to survive transport and storage, the ingredient that made winter survivable in a climate where fresh food was unavailable for months at a time. Whoever controlled salt controlled food security, and whoever controlled food security had leverage over every community within trading distance. The Hallstatt culture, whose period of dominance runs roughly from 800 to 450 BCE, sat atop one of the richest salt deposits in Europe and built their wealth and power on its extraction and distribution. The archaeological evidence from Hallstatt itself and from the hundreds of elite burials that have been excavated across the broader Hallstatt cultural zone, covering what is now Austria, Germany, France, and Switzerland, reveals a society of considerable sophistication and stratification. The grave goods of Hallstatt elites include bronze vessels imported from the Mediterranean world, gold jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship, weapons of high-quality iron, and the horse-drawn vehicles that marked the highest social rank. These were people who had access to the luxury goods of a continent-spanning trade network, who could afford to have skilled craftsmen produce objects of great beauty, and who expressed their status in the elaborate burial ceremonies that are our primary window into their world. The famous salt mine at Hallstatt has preserved, through the accidental miracle of salt's desiccating properties, organic materials that would normally have rotted away millennia ago. Wooden tools, leather clothing, ropes, food remnants, and even the bodies of miners who died in ancient accidents have been recovered from the mine, providing an unparalleled picture of daily working life in an early Iron Age mining community. The scale of the operation, with tunnels penetrating hundreds of meters into the mountain, organized around systematic extraction and processing, implies a level of industrial organization and management that would be impressive in any pre-modern context. The people who worked these mines were not slaves, or at least not exclusively. The community that lived in the valley below was a mix of skilled workers, traders, and the noble families who controlled the mine's revenues. Their material culture was distinctly Central European. The pottery, the metalwork, the architectural styles all belong to a tradition rooted in the Bronze Age cultures of the Alpine region. But the trade connections that salt enabled brought them into contact with the Mediterranean world in ways that left traces in their art and their burial customs. The question of when the Hallstatt culture became Celtic, when the people of the Alpine highlands began to speak Celtic languages and identify themselves with the cultural tradition that would eventually spread across Europe, is one of the more contested questions in European prehistoric archaeology. The relationship between language, culture, and ethnicity is always complex, and the assumption that there was a single moment when the Celts arrived in Central Europe is almost certainly wrong. The Celtic identity and the Celtic languages probably emerged gradually from the interaction of multiple Bronze Age cultures across a wide geographic area, and the Hallstatt culture represents an early phase of this emergence rather than a clearly defined starting point. But by the time the Hallstatt period gives way to the Tène culture around 450 BCE, something recognizable as Celtic civilization, in its art, its religious practices, its social organization, and its language, is clearly present across a substantial part of Europe. The Celts never built an empire in the sense that Rome or Persia built empires, a single political entity with a central administration, a professional bureaucracy, and a unified legal system extending authority over a defined territory. What they built instead was something harder to map and harder to destroy: a shared civilization, a web of cultural practices, religious beliefs, artistic traditions, and social institutions that linked communities across an enormous geographic range without requiring political unification to sustain itself. Understanding how Celtic society actually worked requires setting aside the imperial model and looking instead at the specific institutions through which Celtic communities organized themselves. The hill fort was the most visible physical expression of Celtic political and social organization in much of Europe. These were not simply defensive installations. They were community centers, marketplaces, religious sites, and symbols of political authority simultaneously. The largest hill forts, which archaeologists call oppida, from the Latin term Caesar used for them, were genuinely urban in scale. Enclosed areas of many hectares, organized around planned streets, with specialized craft production areas, storage facilities, religious precincts, and residential zones. Manching in Bavaria, Bibracte in Burgundy, and Maiden Castle in Dorset are among the best studied of these sites, and they reveal communities of considerable complexity and organization. The social hierarchy of Celtic communities was built around a fundamental distinction between the noble warrior class, the specialized intellectual class of Druids and bards, and the free farmers and craftsmen who formed the majority of the population. At the top of the warrior nobility was the chieftain, the ri or rai in the Celtic languages, whose authority derived from a combination of personal military prowess, ancestral legitimacy, and the ability to maintain the loyalty of the armed warriors who supported his leadership. The Celtic chieftain was not an absolute monarch. He held his position as long as he could command respect, distribute wealth generously among his followers, and demonstrate the personal courage that the warrior culture demanded. The institution of the feast, the formal communal banquet at which the chieftain distributed food, drink, and gifts among his followers, was one of the most important political institutions in Celtic society. The feast was not merely a social occasion, it was a performance of political relationships. The seating arrangement expressed hierarchy, the portions distributed expressed favor or disfavor, the gifts given sealed alliances and obligations, and the whole event was governed by elaborate protocols whose violation carried serious social consequences. A chieftain who held inadequate feasts, who failed to distribute wealth generously, or who allowed the feast to degenerate into disorder, was failing in one of his most fundamental political obligations. The champion's portion, the right of the best warrior present to receive the choicest cut of meat at the feast, was a recognized institution in Celtic society that appears repeatedly in the Irish mythological texts that preserve much of what we know about early Celtic social practice. The enforcement of this right, and the disputes that inevitably arose about who deserved it, could and did lead to violence at feasts, violence that the sources sometimes present as a legitimate settling of questions of status and precedence. A feast in a Celtic hall was an occasion of both social solidarity and potential confrontation, and managing the tension between these two possibilities was part of what made a skilled chieftain politically effective. The oppida of the later Latin period, the large enclosed settlements that appear across Celtic Europe from about 200 BCE onward, represent a significant evolution in Celtic social organisation, towards something more centralised and more economically specialised than the earlier hill-fort communities. The crafts practised in oppida included not just the metalworking and pottery that any Celtic community needed, but glassmaking, minting, and long-distance trade. The use of coinage, which the Celts adopted from the Greek and Macedonian monetary systems and adapted to their own artistic traditions, implies the existence of commercial transactions of sufficient regularity and scale to require a standardized medium of exchange. The Celtic coins, many of which are of extraordinary artistic quality, are among the most visually striking monetary objects ever produced. No aspect of Celtic civilization has captured the imagination of later ages more persistently or more inaccurately than the Druids. The image of white-robed priests performing mysterious rituals at Stonehenge by moonlight, an image that has been embedded in popular culture since at least the 18th century, is almost entirely fictional, a romantic construction built on fragmentary and often hostile ancient sources combined with modern wishful thinking. The actual Druids were something considerably more interesting and considerably more important. A sophisticated intellectual class whose functions encompassed philosophy, natural science, theology, law, medicine, and political arbitration simultaneously, and whose influence in Celtic society was profound enough to make them the primary target of Roman suppression campaigns. The ancient sources that describe the Druids, primarily Greek and Roman writers, are unanimous on one point. The Druids were the learned class of Celtic society, and their learning was extensive. Caesar, who had more direct contact with Celtic society than most ancient writers, and who had strong political reasons for understanding the societies he was conquering, describes Druids who engaged in extensive philosophical debate about the nature of the universe, the movement of celestial bodies, and the nature of the gods. He notes that Druidical education was an enormously long process, potentially 20 years of study, conducted through oral transmission rather than writing, not because the Druids could not write, but because they held that true knowledge should not be fixed in text, where it could be read by the uninitiated. The Druidic belief in the immortality of the soul, and specifically in the transmigration of souls between successive lives, was remarkable enough to attract comment from Greek philosophers who were aware of it. The Celts' famous courage in battle was attributed by ancient observers partly to this belief. Warriors who genuinely expected to be reborn after death had less reason to fear death than those who did not hold this conviction. Whether the actual Celtic warriors of history shared this philosophical belief or simply had the courage of people who had grown up in a warrior culture is impossible to know. But the connection between Druidic theology and Celtic military psychology was noticed by observers sophisticated enough to think about such connections. The Druids' role in Celtic legal and political life was as important as their religious functions. They served as arbiters in disputes between tribes and individuals, and their judgments carried an authority that even the most powerful chieftains were reluctant to challenge. the power to exclude someone from religious ceremonies, a Druidic excommunication, was described by Caesar as one of the most severe punishments available in Celtic society, effectively removing the excluded person from the social fabric of the community. This gave the Druids leverage over political actors that had no equivalent in most ancient societies, where religious and political authority were separated. The sacred sites of the Druids, the groves of oak trees where the most important religious ceremonies were conducted, have left little archaeological trace, since they were natural features rather than constructed monuments. But the deposits of votive objects in lakes, rivers, and bogs across Celtic Europe give a vivid impression of the religious practice that the Druids oversaw. The Celtic practice of depositing valuable objects, weapons, jewellery, food, and in some cases human remains, in watery places reflects a theology in which such places were boundaries between the human world and the divine world, and in which gifts to the gods were most effectively delivered at these boundaries. The extraordinary quality of many votive deposits, the Battersea shield from the Thames, the Gundestrup cauldron from a Danish bog, the Iron Age deposits at La Tène in Switzerland that gave the second phase of Celtic culture its name, suggests that the objects given to the gods were not the discards of everyday life, but the finest things the community could produce. The Gundestrup cauldron deserves particular attention. Found dismantled in a Danish peat bog in 1891, it is a large silver vessel decorated with panels showing divine figures, ritual scenes, and the sacred animals of Celtic religion. The antlered god Cernunnos, surrounded by wildlife, processions of warriors and elephants, a great figure immersing smaller human figures in a cauldron. Its origins are debated. Stylistic analysis suggests it was made by a craftsman familiar with both Celtic and Thracian artistic traditions. But its deposit in a Danish bog places it firmly within the Celtic religious practice of votive offering. Whatever its origins, the Gundestrup cauldron is one of the most important surviving documents of Celtic religious imagination, and its images give us a window into the mythological world of the Druids that the purely textual sources cannot provide. The transition from the Hallstatt culture to the Tène culture around 450 BCE marks a transformation in Celtic art and technology so dramatic that the two phases are conventionally treated as distinct archaeological periods, even though the material continuities between them are considerable and the populations involved were the same people. The La Tène style, named for the site on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where a massive deposit of Celtic metalwork was discovered in the 19th century, is one of the most immediately recognizable artistic traditions in human history. A style of flowing curves, animal forms dissolving into abstract patterns, faces emerging from foliage, and geometric complexity that maintains balance and harmony across surfaces of any scale. The La Tène style was not an isolated aesthetic preference. It was the visual language of a civilization, a system of symbols and forms that communicated identity, status, and meaning across the entire Celtic world. A craftsman in Ireland and a craftsman in what is now Turkey were working within the same broad artistic tradition, using the same repertoire of forms, the same techniques, and the same underlying aesthetic principles. The fact that this visual coherence was maintained across such enormous geographic distances without any central authority enforcing stylistic standards is testimony to the power of cultural transmission through the networks of trade, gift exchange, and shared religious practice that connected Celtic communities across Europe. The technology that underlies La Tène material culture was iron, the metal that gave the Iron Age its name, and that the Celtic smiths mastered with a completeness that made them the leading metallurgists of the Western world during this period. Iron had decisive advantages over the bronze it replaced. Iron ore is far more common than the copper and tin needed to make bronze. Iron tools and weapons can be resharpened and repaired rather than simply being discarded when worn. And iron, properly worked, produces edges harder and more durable than bronze can achieve. The Celtic smiths who controlled the technology of iron production and ironworking were the holders of a strategic technological advantage, and the quality of their products, above all their swords, was recognized across the ancient world. The Celtic sword of the Tène period was a weapon of extraordinary quality. The long, pattern-welded blades, made by twisting and folding iron rods of different carbon content together, then drawing them out into a blade, combined toughness with flexibility in ways that the simpler iron weapons of other cultures could not match. Hilts and scabbards of elite Celtic swords were decorated with Tène metalwork of the highest quality. Interlaced patterns, animal heads, coral and enamel inlay, making each high-status weapon a work of art as well as a fighting instrument. The scabbard found at Kirkburn in Yorkshire, dating to the 3rd century BCE and now in the British Museum, is among the most beautiful objects in early European art. The Celtic chariot was another technological achievement that combined engineering skill with the artistic sensibility of Tène style. The iron-shod wheels, the bronze fittings, the carefully balanced construction that allowed fast, maneuverable movement across varied terrain. The Celtic chariot was both a military vehicle and a status symbol, and the elaborate chariot burials found across Celtic Europe demonstrate its importance as a marker of the highest social rank. The technology of Celtic wheelmaking, which included the use of iron tire, heated and then cooled on the wheel to provide a secure fit through the physics of thermal contraction, was sophisticated enough to be adopted by Roman craftsmen who encountered it. The roundhouse was the standard domestic architecture of Celtic Britain and Ireland, a circular structure with a timber post frame, wattle and daub walls, and a thatched roof, ranging from modest single-room dwellings to large communal buildings with internal divisions. The roundhouse has been dismissed in the past as a simple, primitive form of shelter, but experimental reconstructions demonstrate that these structures were extraordinarily effective. Warm, waterproof, structurally sound, and capable of housing large family groups with their animals during winter. The social life organized around the central hearth of a roundhouse, the fire that was both the physical and symbolic center of the household, was the basic unit of Celtic communal existence, the place where stories were told, decisions were made, and the values of the culture were transmitted from generation to generation. The Celtic craftsman's workshop was also a center of cultural production in a broader sense. The smith who forged iron swords was working with a material that had near magical associations in the Celtic world. Iron was the metal that drove away supernatural forces, the material that required both technical skill and a kind of knowledge that bordered on the esoteric. The smith's craft was surrounded by ritual and symbolic significance that made the practitioner something more than a technical worker. The best smiths were figures of considerable social standing, and the finest of their products, the swords, the torques, the decorated shields, were objects that combined practical function with symbolic weight in ways that no purely utilitarian description can capture. When a Celtic warrior carried an elaborately decorated sword into battle, he was carrying not just a weapon, but a statement about the world he inhabited and the values he embodied. The economic foundation of Celtic civilization, the network of trade routes that connected the salt mines of the Alpine region to the tin deposits of Cornwall, the amber of the Baltic coast to the wine cellars of the Greek colonies on the Mediterranean shore, was one of the most extensive commercial systems in the ancient world, and its existence is the primary reason why a single artistic and cultural tradition could spread across so enormous a geographic range. Trade was the nervous system of the Celtic world, and the routes along which goods flowed were also the routes along which ideas, technologies, and cultural practices travelled. Salt was the commodity that started it all. The control of salt production in the Alpine region gave the Hallstatt culture its initial wealth and commercial reach, and the distribution networks established for salt trade were the infrastructure within which other goods moved. The prestige goods that appear in the richest Hallstatt burials, the Attic pottery, the bronze wine-mixing vessels, the silk textiles, came through these networks from the Mediterranean world, traded northward by Greek and Etruscan merchants who were happy to accept salt, furs, slaves, and amber in exchange. The tin trade was equally fundamental. Bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that had been the primary technological metal of European civilization for over 1,000 years before the Iron Age, required both copper and tin was scarce. The richest tin deposits in the accessible ancient world were in Cornwall, at the southwestern tip of Britain, and the routes that connected Cornish tin to the bronze working communities of the continent were among the most economically significant trade routes in pre-Roman Europe. Celtic communities in both Britain and Gaul controlled key segments of these routes, and the wealth that the tin trade generated is visible in the rich burials of communities along its path. The Greek wine trade with Celtic Gaul and southern Germany is one of the best documented aspects of Celtic commercial activity, because it left physical evidence in the form of enormous numbers of imported Greek and Italian wine amphorae in archaeological sites across the Celtic world. Wine was a luxury good of high prestige in Celtic society, and the appetite of Celtic elites for imported wine, drunk from imported bronze vessels in ceremonies that probably adapted Greek symposium culture to Celtic social practice, drove a significant commercial flow between the Mediterranean world and the Celtic interior. The famous Vix crater, a massive Greek bronze wine-mixing vessel found in a princess burial in Burgundy and now in the Châtillon-sur-Seine Museum, represents the summit of this prestige import trade. A vessel over 1 meter tall and weighing over 200 kilograms, imported from Greece and buried with a Celtic noblewoman of the highest rank. The Celtic coinage system that developed from about 300 BCE onward reflects the commercial sophistication of late Latin Celtic society. The Celts encountered coinage through their mercenary service in Greek and Macedonian armies and their trade contacts with the Mediterranean world, and they adapted the monetary form with characteristic creativity. Celtic coins are distinguished by their artistic originality. Images that began as derivative of Greek prototypes were progressively transformed by Celtic artists into compositions of abstract beauty that bear only the faintest resemblance to their Mediterranean origins. The head of Apollo on a Greek gold stater became, in Celtic hands, a swirling mass of curvilinear forms that is simultaneously a face and a pattern. Celtic coinage is thus not only an economic document, but an artistic one, showing the transformation of borrowed forms through the creative energy of the Latin style. The torque, the twisted gold or silver neck ring, that was one of the most important prestige objects in Celtic culture, circulated through these trade networks as a form of wearable wealth that could be given as a gift, used as a reward for military service, melted down and refashioned when circumstances required, or buried with its owner as a statement of status that would last beyond death. The Snettisham hoard in Norfolk, a deposit of over 100 torques and torque fragments, some of extraordinary quality, buried in the 1st century BCE, is the richest Celtic metalwork deposit found in Britain, and a vivid reminder of the wealth that the commercial networks of the Celtic world could generate and concentrate. The political history of Celtic Europe in the centuries immediately before the Roman conquest is in large part the story of why political unity, the kind of unified political structure that would have given the Celts the organizational capacity to resist Roman power effectively, never developed among a people whose cultural coherence might seem to have made it possible. The Celts were united by language, by art, by religion, and by a shared set of social values, but they were divided by kinship loyalties, by competitive pride between chieftains, by the structural incentives of a warrior culture that valued individual glory over collective strategy, and by the absence of the administrative traditions that allowed other ancient civilizations to build durable, large-scale political entities. The tribal structure of Celtic society was both its social foundation and its political limitation. A tribe, the Tua in Irish, the civitas in the Latin of Caesar's Gallic Wars, was the basic political unit, a community defined by kinship, territory, and common allegiance to a ruling family, typically numbering in the tens of thousands of people in its free population. Within the tribe, the obligations of kinship and clientship were binding and deeply felt. Beyond the tribe, obligations were weaker, more contingent, and more easily dissolved when interests conflicted. The large tribal confederations that emerge in the historical record of the last 2 centuries BCE, groups like the Arverni of central Gaul, the Aedui of Burgundy, the Belgae of northern Gaul, and the Iceni of eastern Britain, represented attempts to build larger political units capable of more effective military and economic organization. These confederations could sometimes mobilize very large military forces, the forces that Caesar faced at various points in his Gallic campaigns, numbered in the hundreds of thousands by his account, though modern scholars take his numbers with some skepticism. But they could not maintain the internal coherence needed for sustained military campaigns, because the constituent tribes retained their independent political identities and could withdraw their support when their immediate interests were not served. The Druids were the institution best positioned to provide some degree of intertribal authority. Their role as arbiters of disputes between tribes gave them a function that crossed tribal boundaries, and the great Druidic assemblies held annually in the territory of the Carnutes in central Gaul gathered participants from across the Celtic world. But Druidic authority was moral and religious rather than military or administrative, and it could not compel military cooperation between tribes that had decided their interests pointed in different directions. The role of the Aedui, the Gaulish tribe that maintained a long-standing alliance with Rome and provided Caesar with both logistical support and political intelligence during his Gallic campaigns, illustrates the fatal structural weakness of Celtic political unity. The Aedui chose alliance with Rome partly for economic reasons, partly from existing treaty relationships, and partly from the calculation that Roman support could be used against their tribal rivals, particularly the Arverni. This calculation was not irrational from the perspective of Aedian tribal interest, but from the perspective of Gaulish independence as a whole, it was catastrophic. It gave Caesar the ally he needed in central Gaul and prevented the formation of a unified Gaulish military response until too late. The attempts at unity that did occur, most notably under Vercingetorix in 52 BCE, whose story will be told in the episode on Great Celtic Leaders, show what Celtic political organization could achieve when it was able to transcend the normal limitations of tribal loyalty. But they also show the limits of what could be achieved. The coalition that Vercingetorix assembled was remarkable, but it was ultimately unstable, and its defeat owed something to the internal tensions that tribal politics always generated. The institution of clientship, the formal relationship of dependency and obligation between a more powerful patron and a less powerful client, was the connective tissue of Celtic social organization at every level, from the great chieftain and his noble retinue down to the farmer and the neighboring lord who protected his land. The client owed service, tribute, and political loyalty to the patron. The patron owed protection, hospitality, and the loan of cattle or other productive resources to the client. This network of mutual obligations was the structure that held Celtic communities together in the absence of the bureaucratic state, and its logic of personal loyalty and reciprocal obligation was both the strength and the limitation of Celtic political culture. It bound communities together in webs of relationship that were deeply felt and socially enforced. But it also meant that every political calculation was filtered through the question of what a specific patron-client relationship required, making it difficult to generate the kind of impersonal loyalty to an abstract political entity, a nation, a cause, that effective resistance to Rome would ultimately have required. In 390 BCE, or possibly 387 BCE, the ancient sources are imprecise, something happened in central Italy that the Romans would remember for centuries as one of the greatest catastrophes in their history. A Celtic army from northern Italy crossed the Apennines, defeated a Roman force at the Battle of the Allia River, and sacked the city of Rome. The event was traumatic enough to become a defining moment in Roman cultural memory, and the phrase Gaulish terror, mitus Gallicus, became a recurring feature of Roman political rhetoric for centuries afterward, invoked to justify emergency measures and to remind the Roman people of the existential threats they had survived. The Celtic group that sacked Rome was the Senones, one of the Celtic tribes that had crossed the Alps into northern Italy in the period between roughly 400 and 350 BCE, and had established themselves in the fertile Po Valley and the Adriatic coast. The process of Celtic settlement in what the Romans would call Gallia Cisalpina, Gaul on this side of the Alps, was part of a broader expansion of Celtic population across Europe that saw Celtic-speaking peoples moving into territories that had previously been occupied by other cultures. The Po Valley had been Etruscan territory. Northern Spain had been occupied by Iberian peoples. The region around the Black Sea had been home to various steppe cultures. Anatolia would receive Celtic settlers who became the Galatians. The Celtic expansion of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE was one of the most significant demographic movements in European prehistory. The army that sacked Rome was led, according to later tradition, by a chieftain named Brennus, a name or title that means king or chief in the Celtic languages, and which may refer to a specific historical individual or may be a generic designation. The story that has attached itself to the name Brennus, the famous episode in which the defeated Romans, being weighed out a tribute of gold, protested that the weights used were too heavy, and Brennus responded by throwing his sword onto the scale and declaring "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished, is almost certainly legendary in its details. But the cultural attitude it expresses is genuine. The contempt of the warrior for the defeated, the insistence on the absolute prerogative of the conqueror, the refusal to be bound by the conventions of civilized negotiation. The Celts, who ranged across the ancient Mediterranean world as mercenaries, were among the most feared soldiers available for hire in the 3rd century BCE. Celtic warriors served in the armies of Carthage against Rome, in the armies of the successor states of Alexander's empire, and in the armies of the Greek city-states against each other. The terrifying effect of Celtic warriors in battle, the war cries, the carnyx horn, whose sound ancient sources describe as both frightening and inhuman, the display of severed enemy heads, and the willingness to advance into battle with apparently reckless disregard for personal safety, made them effective shock troops, whose psychological impact was as important as their physical strength. The Celtic invasion of Greece and the attack on Delphi in 279 BCE extended the geographic range of Celtic military power to its furthest point. The Delphic oracle was the most sacred site in the Greek world, the navel of the world, the seat of Apollo's wisdom, the place where the future could be learned. That Celtic warriors attacked it, and were, according to Greek sources, miraculously repelled by the god himself through earthquakes, storms, and visions that sent them fleeing, was a shock to the Greek world comparable to the sack of Rome had been to the Romans. The defeat of the Celtic force at Delphi and the subsequent settlement of Celtic warriors in Anatolia as the Galatians marked the eastern limit of Celtic military expansion. The carnyx, the Celtic war trumpet, whose bell was shaped like an animal head, typically a boar or serpent, and which was held vertically so that the sound came from high above the battlefield, is one of the most evocative artifacts of Celtic military culture. Ancient sources describe its sound as harsh, discordant, and terrifying. A reconstruction of the carnyx from the Deskford carnyx, found in Scotland and now in Edinburgh, produces a sound that modern audiences find both alien and compelling. A reminder that the psychological warfare of the Celts was as sophisticated as their physical fighting techniques. At the peak of Celtic expansion, somewhere around the 3rd century BCE, the Celtic cultural world extended from the Galatian settlements in central Anatolia, where the descendants of the Celtic warriors who had attacked Delphi established a kingdom that survived into the Roman period, and that St. Paul would later address in one of his letters. To the western shores of Ireland, where Celtic languages and cultural practices continued to develop in relative isolation from the transformations that Roman conquest would bring to the rest of the Celtic world. This is an east-west distance of roughly 5,000 kilometers. And across this entire range, communities shared enough cultural vocabulary, enough common artistic forms, religious practices, and social institutions to be recognizable to each other as participants in the same broad civilization. The Celtiberians of the Iberian Peninsula, the Celtic-speaking peoples who had settled in central and northern Spain, mixing with the existing Iberian population to create the hybrid culture that the Romans called Celtiberian, were organized in a warrior society recognizably similar to that of their Gaulish and British relatives, with hill forts, tribal political organization, and the characteristic Celtic warrior values. Their resistance to Roman conquest was among the most stubborn the Romans encountered anywhere in their empire building. The siege of Numantia in 133 BCE, in which a Roman army under Scipio Aemilianus besieged the Celtiberian city for over a year, built a complete circumvallation around it, and ultimately starved its population into surrender, became one of the Roman world's celebrated examples of military tenacity against an opponent who refused to submit. The Celtic world in Britain was diverse. The tribes of southern Britain, those of Wales, those of northern Britain, who would eventually provide the core of what became Scotland, and the Irish Celts, each had their own specific cultural characters within the broader Celtic framework. The British tribes were in close commercial and cultural contact with Gaulish tribes across the Channel. Caesar mentions British involvement in Gaulish affairs, and the archaeological record shows continuous material exchange. While the Irish Celts developed in greater isolation, a Celtic culture that preserved archaic features no longer present in the more Romanized British and Gaulish communities. The oral literary tradition of the Celts, the body of stories, genealogies, legal precedents, mythological narratives, and poetic forms that the bards and Druids preserved and transmitted through memory, was the cultural equivalent of the written literature of literate civilizations. Celtic oral poetry had formal rules of extraordinary complexity, prescribed meters, required allusions, conventional formulas, and elaborate systems of praise and satire that were as demanding as any written literary tradition. The bard who could compose correctly in the prescribed forms was a master of a demanding art, and the social power of the bard, whose praise could elevate a chieftain's reputation and whose satire could destroy it, was a real form of cultural authority. The mythology that eventually made it into written form in the Irish and Welsh manuscripts of the medieval period, the cycles of stories about gods, heroes, and supernatural events that constitute the Celtic mythological tradition, preserves, in transformed and Christianized form, elements of a pre-Christian Celtic religious imagination of great richness and complexity. The Tuatha De Danann of Irish mythology, the Mabinogion of Welsh tradition, the Arthurian cycle, all draw on a Celtic mythological substratum that connects them to the religious world of the Druids and the cultural imagination of the pre-Roman Celtic world. The other world of Celtic mythology, the realm of the divine that coexisted with the human world, accessible through certain liminal places and at certain liminal times, was not a distant heaven or underworld in the Mediterranean religious sense, but a place of beauty and abundance that interpenetrated with the visible world in ways that made the boundary between them constantly present. The mounds and lakes and islands at the western edge of the sea that served as entrances to the other world were real places that the Celts lived among, and the understanding that the divine world was spatially present, that you could, in the right circumstances, walk into it, gave Celtic religious experience a quality of immediate, embodied contact with the sacred that is quite different from the more transcendent religious imagination of the Mediterranean traditions. This quality of sacred immanence, the sense that the divine is present in the natural world rather than removed
from it, is one of the most distinctive features of Celtic religious culture, and it is one that has survived in transformed versions in the folk traditions and landscape sensibilities of the Celtic countries down to the present day. Three names, above all others, have come to represent the Celtic capacity for heroic resistance against overwhelming power. Brennus, who sacked Rome, Vercingetorix, who came closer than anyone to defeating Julius Caesar, and Boudicca, the British queen whose uprising very nearly drove the Romans out of Britain. Each represents a different moment in the Celtic confrontation with the expanding power of Rome, and together they trace the arc of a resistance that was ultimately unsuccessful, but that demonstrated, repeatedly, the military and political capabilities that Celtic society could produce when it was able to transcend the limitations of tribal division. Brennus, or the chieftain who carried that title, belongs to the earliest phase of Celtic-Roman interaction, the period in the early 4th century BCE when Rome was still a regional Italian power rather than a Mediterranean empire. The sack of Rome in 390 BCE was a genuine catastrophe for the city, and the Roman recovery from it, which involved a generation of military rebuilding and institutional reform, shaped the Roman Republic in ways that made it more resilient and more militarily effective. The trauma of the sack was real, but so was the Roman response. The determination that Rome would never again be vulnerable to a Celtic attack drove military reforms that eventually made Rome the most effective military power in the ancient world. Vercingetorix was a young Arvernian noble who in 52 BCE accomplished something that no other Celtic leader had managed. He organized a coalition of Gaulish tribes into a coordinated military alliance against Caesar's campaigns, and he sustained that alliance through a winter of hardship and a summer of desperate fighting that brought Caesar closer to defeat than the Roman general would comfortably admit. His strategic insight, that the Gauls could not defeat Caesar in open battle and must instead pursue a scorched earth strategy that denied the Roman army food and supplies while maintaining pressure on its communications, was militarily sound and would have been even more effective if it had been fully implemented. The decision to break the strategy and attempt to relieve the besieged city of Avaricum, made under pressure from the tribal leaders whose home territories were being burned, was a compromise that weakened the campaign at a critical moment. The story of Vercingetorix ends at Alesia, the fortified hilltop where he made his final stand with tens of thousands of warriors, while a relief army of perhaps 250,000 attacked the Roman circumvallation from outside. Caesar's construction of a double ring of fortifications around Alesia, facing inward to contain Vercingetorix and outward to defend against the relief force, is one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of ancient warfare, and his ability to hold both lines simultaneously with his legions was the military achievement that secured his Gallic conquest. Vercingetorix surrendered personally to Caesar, riding out of the gates of Alesia in his finest armor, and was taken to Rome as a prisoner. He was kept for Caesar's triumph 6 years later, paraded through Rome's streets, and then executed. He was probably in his early 30s. Boudicca was queen of the Iceni tribe in what is now Norfolk in eastern England, and her uprising in approximately 60 or 61 CE was the most serious military challenge the Roman occupation of Britain ever faced. The immediate cause was the Roman seizure of Iceni lands and property following the death of her husband, the client king Prasutagus, combined with the brutal treatment of Boudicca herself and her daughters. The Romans who controlled Britain in the early years of the occupation had apparently not understood, or had chosen not to respect, the political reality that Boudicca represented real authority among the Iceni, and that violating her person was the kind of action that could trigger a province-wide uprising. Boudicca's forces destroyed 3 Roman towns, Camulodunum, Colchester, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, in a series of attacks that killed perhaps 70,000 people. The Roman governor Gaius Suetonius, Paulinus, who had been conducting a campaign against the Druids on the island of Anglesey when the uprising began, was forced to abandon his campaign and march south. The final battle, whose location is unknown, was a Roman tactical victory against a numerically superior Celtic force, won through the disciplined use of Roman legionary tactics in terrain that denied the Iceni their numerical advantage. Boudicca died after the battle, either by her own hand or from illness. The sources disagree. She became a symbol of British resistance, and her statue stands today on the Thames embankment opposite the Houses of Parliament. Gaius Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, conducted between 58 and 51 BCE, and described in his own account, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, one of the most famous pieces of Latin prose ever written, were the military operations that ended Celtic civilization as an independent political force on the European continent. The conquest of Gaul killed, by Caesar's own account, 1 million people and enslaved another million, numbers that modern scholars debate but that no one dismisses as pure invention. It was one of the most destructive military operations of the ancient world, and its consequences for the Celtic peoples of continental Europe were permanent. Caesar's motivations were complex. He needed military glory and the political capital that military success provided in the competitive Roman political environment of the late Republic. He needed money, enormous amounts of it, to pay for the political alliances and the military forces that his career required. And a successful Gallic campaign would provide both glory and plunder. And he had the opportunity. Gaul was rich, the tribes were divided, and the internal conflicts of Gaulish politics provided repeated pretexts for Roman intervention. The military superiority of the Roman legions over Celtic tribal forces was not absolute. The Gauls could and did defeat Roman forces in various engagements, but it was systematic and persistent in ways that eventually wore down Celtic resistance. Roman military engineering, the ability to build camps, siege works, bridges, and roads at speed and to a professional standard, gave the legions capabilities that no Celtic force could match. Roman discipline, the ability to maintain formation under pressure, to execute complex tactical maneuvers while under attack, to sustain campaigning over years without the tribal politics that broke up Celtic coalitions, was an organizational advantage that no amount of individual courage could overcome indefinitely. The destruction of the Druidical establishment at Anglesey by the governor Suetonius Paulinus in 60 CE, just before Boudicca's uprising forced him to withdraw, was a deliberate act of religious and cultural suppression. The island of Anglesey had become a refuge for Druids fleeing Roman authority in Gaul, and it was the center of the Druidical resistance to Roman cultural domination of Britain. The Roman attack, which the soldiers initially hesitated to begin, reportedly awed by the sight of robed figures with torches and screaming women, destroyed the sacred groves and killed the Druids who defended them. The suppression of Druidism was as much a cultural conquest as a military one. Rome understood that the Druids were the institutional backbone of Celtic resistance, and their elimination was a strategic objective. The Romanization that followed the military conquest of Gaul and Britain was not experienced uniformly. In the cities, the oppida that became Roman provincial towns, Roman culture was adopted with varying degrees of enthusiasm by the local Celtic elite, who found that Roman administrative and commercial practices offered new opportunities for wealth and influence. The Celtic nobility who became Roman citizens adopted Latin names, built Roman-style houses, and sent their sons to Roman schools were not simply surrendering their identity. They were navigating the transition to a new political order with the pragmatic intelligence of people who understood where power now resided. But the Druidical learning, the oral literary tradition, the religious practices centered on sacred groves and votive deposits, these did not survive Romanization in Gaul. They retreated to the margins, and eventually they largely disappeared. One of the most striking features of the archaeological record of Celtic Europe is the sheer quantity of high-quality metalwork that was deliberately deposited in watery places, rivers, lakes, bogs, and springs, in ways that made retrieval impossible, or at least extremely difficult. These deposits, the hoards that have been recovered from the Thames at London, from the lake at La Tène in Switzerland, from Llyn Cerrig Bach in Wales, from Snettisham in Norfolk, and from hundreds of other sites, represent an enormous investment of wealth that was voluntarily surrendered to the water, and understanding why requires understanding the Celtic religious imagination. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the divine was, in Celtic belief, most permeable at liminal places, places of transition between states of being. Water was the primary such liminal medium. The surface of a lake or river was the boundary between the upper world and the lower world, and objects dropped through that surface were delivered to the divine realm in a way that terrestrial burial could not achieve. The weapons, the jewelry, the coins, the cauldrons, and the occasional human remains found in watery deposits across Celtic Europe were gifts to the gods, sacrifices that expressed gratitude, sought favor, or fulfilled vows made at moments of crisis. The quality of the objects in many Celtic hoards is extraordinary. Not the discarded debris of everyday life, but the finest things their makers could produce. The Battersea shield, recovered from the Thames near Battersea in London, is a ceremonial shield of bronze and red enamel so beautiful that it was almost certainly never used in actual combat. The Waterloo helmet, also from the Thames,
is another ceremonial object of such quality that its deposit in the river must represent a significant sacrifice by whoever owned it. These were not cheap offerings. They were the kind of sacrifice that demonstrated the depth of the relationship between the worshipper and the divine. The bards who served as the Celtic world's information network and cultural memory system occupied a position in Celtic society that combined artistic, religious, and political functions in ways that have no precise modern equivalent. The bard was not simply an entertainer, though entertainment was certainly part of the function. The bard was a historian whose medium was song, a journalist whose distribution network was the road between chieftains' halls, a political commentator whose praise and satire had real social force, and a keeper of genealogies and legal precedents, whose memory preserved information that the absence of writing made it impossible to store any other way. The power of bardic satire in Celtic society was not metaphorical. A skilled bard whose patron had been wronged could compose satire specific enough to identify the wrongdoer, memorable enough to be retold across the Celtic world, and cutting enough to follow the target for the rest of their life. The satire could, according to Celtic belief, cause physical harm, raise blisters on the skin of the satirized person, as well as social and reputational damage. This belief in the physical power of the bard's words gave the bardic class a weapon of genuine social force, and the fear of bardic satire was a real restraint on the behavior of powerful people. The Celtic world that had dominated Europe through the La Tène period was not static. It was continuously changing, absorbing new technologies, adapting to new political realities, and responding to the challenges posed by the expanding powers of Rome in the south and the Germanic peoples in the north. The story of Celtic decline in the last 2 centuries BCE and the 1st century CE is not simply the story of conquest from outside, but also the story of internal transformation, of a civilization that was changing even as it was being challenged, and that responded to those challenges with varying degrees of success. The development of more effective iron weapons among the Germanic peoples of Northern Europe, the same technologies that the Celts had pioneered, gradually eroded the military technological advantage that Celtic smiths had held. By the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the quality differential between Celtic and Germanic ironwork was narrowing, and the Germanic peoples who pressed against the northern borders of the Celtic world were increasingly capable of meeting Celtic warriors on roughly equal technological terms. The social cohesion of Germanic tribal society, with its strong warrior band loyalty and its resistance to the kind of internal political competition that weakened Celtic confederacies, gave Germanic military forces organizational advantages that partly compensated for whatever technological disadvantages they retained. The arrival of Christianity in the Celtic world, beginning in the 4th century CE in Britain and accelerating dramatically with the missions to Ireland in the 5th century, above all through the work of St. Patrick, was the cultural transformation that most fundamentally changed what it meant to be Celtic. The relationship between Celtic culture and Christianity was not simply the replacement of one belief system by another. In Ireland especially, where Roman conquest never occurred, and where Celtic cultural traditions had developed for centuries without the Romanizing pressures that transformed Britain and Gaul, Christianity was absorbed into a distinctively Celtic cultural framework that preserved elements of the older tradition while transforming them. The Celtic Church that emerged in Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries CE was recognizably Christian in its theology, but distinctively Celtic in its organizational structure, organized around monasteries rather than dioceses, emphasizing learning and manuscript production in ways that preserved both Christian and classical texts, and maintaining connections with the natural world that echoed, in transformed Christian form, the older Druidical relationship with sacred landscapes. The Irish monasteries of the early medieval period, Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Iona, became centres of learning that preserved and transmitted classical and Christian knowledge at a time when the rest of Western Europe was struggling with the consequences of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The illuminated manuscripts produced in these Irish monasteries, the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Durrow, are among the supreme achievements of European art, and they make unmistakable use of the Latin artistic vocabulary that had been the visual language of Celtic culture for centuries. The interlaced patterns, the animal forms dissolving into abstract decoration, the complex geometries organized around spiral and curved motifs. These are the Latin style, transformed by Christian content and purpose into something new while remaining recognizably themselves. The art of the Celtic Church is the most visible demonstration that Celtic culture was not destroyed by its encounter with Christianity, but transformed by it into something that would prove remarkably durable. The history of the Celtic peoples in the centuries between Caesar's conquest of Gaul and the final establishment of the Germanic kingdoms in the former Western Roman Empire is the history of a long, uneven retreat. Not a sudden defeat, but a gradual contraction of the territory and the cultural independence of communities whose ancestors had ranged across an entire continent. The forces driving this retreat were multiple and overlapping. Roman military conquest in the south, Germanic population pressure in the north, and the internal consequences of a social structure that had never developed the administrative institutions needed to maintain large-scale political unity against sustained external pressure. The Celtic tribes of Gaul were the first to experience this transformation comprehensively. Caesar's conquest was followed by a generation of Roman provincial administration that progressively Romanized the Gaulish elite, converting them, through the irresistible combination of Roman education, Roman legal citizenship, Roman commercial opportunities, and Roman political integration, into provincial Romans who happened to have Celtic ancestry. The Gaulish language did not disappear overnight. It was probably still spoken in rural areas of Gaul for several centuries after Caesar, but it was progressively displaced by Latin as the language of education, commerce, administration, and social advancement. The Celtic tribes of Britain experienced a similar but slower Romanization after the Claudian invasion of 43 CE. The southern and eastern British tribes, those closest to the continent and most integrated into the cross-channel commercial networks, were Romanized most quickly. The tribes of Wales, northern Britain, more distant from the centres of Roman administration, in more mountainous and difficult terrain, were Romanized more slowly and incompletely. And the Irish Celts, never conquered by Rome, connected to the Roman world through trade and the occasional raid, but never subject to Roman administration, were not Romanized at all, and preserved the most archaic aspects of Celtic culture into the medieval period. The Germanic pressure on the northern frontiers of the Celtic world was a different kind of threat than Roman conquest, not the organized military campaigns of a state, but the sustained demographic pressure of peoples expanding into Celtic territory, pushing Celtic communities off the best agricultural land and gradually replacing Celtic languages with Germanic ones in regions that had been Celtic-speaking for centuries. The process is difficult to trace in detail because it left few written records on either side, but the archaeological and linguistic evidence shows a steady contraction of Celtic-speaking territory in what is now Germany, the Netherlands, and northern France over the centuries of the early Common Era. The Celtic world that survived the Roman conquest and the Germanic migrations was not the vanquished remnant of a destroyed civilization. It was a living culture that had found its place in the new political geography of post-Roman Europe, and that was producing some of its greatest achievements precisely in the period when Celtic civilization on the continent was contracting most dramatically. The Irish monasteries of the 5th and 6th centuries, the Welsh bardic tradition,
the Scottish kingdoms of Dalriata and Pictland, and the Breton culture of the Armorican Peninsula were not afterthoughts to the Celtic story. They were among its most significant chapters. Ireland, in the early medieval period, was the centre of a remarkable flowering of Celtic literary and artistic culture. The absence of Roman conquest meant that the Irish had no experience of the centralised administrative state. Their political organisation remained the traditional Celtic pattern of multiple kingdoms, dynastic competition, and tribal politics. But it also meant that they had preserved elements of pre-Roman Celtic culture that had been transformed or suppressed elsewhere. When Christianity arrived in Ireland in the 5th century, it encountered a culture with a strong oral, literary tradition, a sophisticated legal system preserved by the legal scholars called brands, a complex poetic tradition with its own elaborate conventions, and a mythological imagination of great richness. The result was a Celtic Christianity that was culturally distinctive and intellectually vital. The Welsh tradition preserved, in the form of medieval Welsh law codes, poetry, and mythology, elements of a British Celtic culture that had been partially Romanized during the centuries of Roman occupation, but that reasserted itself after Roman withdrawal. The poems attributed to the 6th century bards Taliesin and Aneirin, the Gododin, and various other texts, are the earliest surviving vernacular literature of Britain and connect directly to the bardic tradition of the pre-Roman Celtic world. The mythology preserved in the Mabinogion draws on a Celtic religious imagination that predates Christianity and preserves, in transformed form, elements of the Druidical worldview that Roman conquest had suppressed on the continent. Scotland, the region that the Romans called Caledonia and never successfully conquered, was home to the Picts, a Celtic-speaking people whose culture is among the most mysterious in early medieval European history. The Pictish symbol stones, standing stones carved with a distinctive repertoire of abstract symbols and animal figures, are among the most beautiful objects of early medieval art, but their meaning remains largely undeciphered, despite considerable scholarly attention. The Picts maintained their independence from both Roman and Anglo-Saxon power until the 9th century, when they were absorbed into the Kingdom of Scotland through dynastic union with the Gaelic-speaking Dalriatans. Brittany, the Armorican Peninsula of northwestern France, received its Celtic identity not from the pre-Roman Gaulish inhabitants of the region, but from the migration of Brythonic-speaking Celts from southwestern Britain, primarily in the 5th and 6th century CE,
fleeing the Anglo-Saxon settlement of lowland Britain. These migrants brought with them the Brythonic Celtic language and the Celtic cultural traditions of Roman Britain, establishing a Celtic-speaking enclave in what had been Romanized Gaul that has maintained its distinctive identity, its language, its music, its culture, to the present day. The Celts did not disappear. This is the most important thing to understand about the ending of their story, because the story did not end. The Celtic peoples of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, Cornwall, and the Isle of Man speak Celtic languages today, maintain Celtic cultural traditions today, and participate in a living cultural identity that connects them directly to the civilization that once stretched from Anatolia to the Atlantic. Modern Irish, Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, Breton, Cornish, and Manx are all direct descendants of the Celtic languages of the ancient world, and their continued existence represents one of the most remarkable cultural survivals in European history. The festival of Halloween, celebrated on the 31st of October across much of the English-speaking world and increasingly globally, is the most widely known survival of Celtic religious practice in the modern world. Halloween descends directly from Samhain, the great Celtic festival that marked the transition from the light half of the year to the dark half, the moment when the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead became permeable and the ancestors could return. The practices associated with modern Halloween, the costumes representing supernatural beings,
The emphasis on the dead and the uncanny, the movement through the dark streets collecting gifts from houses, all have traceable connections to the liminal, boundary-crossing character of Samhain. Every jack-o'-lantern carved in an American suburb and every trick-or-treating child in Australia is, unknowingly, participating in a ceremony that was already ancient when Caesar was conquering Gaul. The torque, the twisted gold or silver neck ring that was among the most important prestige objects in Celtic society, has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Celtic identity in the modern world, reproduced in jewelry, in sculpture, and in the imagery that Celtic cultural institutions use to identify themselves. The Snettisham torque, the Broiter collar, the numerous torques in museum collections across Europe and Britain continue to attract visitors and generate wonder, testimony to the fact that the aesthetic intelligence of Celtic craftsmen 2,000 years ago still communicates directly to modern viewers. The DNA evidence has confirmed what historians of Celtic culture had long suspected. The Celts did not disappear from their former territories. They were politically subjugated and culturally absorbed while remaining biologically present. The genetic analysis of modern British, Irish, and other European populations shows substantial continuity with the Iron Age populations of these regions. The genes of the people who built the hill forts, worshipped in the sacred groves, and buried their dead with Tène metalwork are present in the people who live on those same lands today. The Celtic past is not foreign history. It is the inheritance of a very large number of living people. The site of Hallstatt in Austria, where the story of Celtic civilization begins, in the salt mines above the Still Lake, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most photographed villages in Europe. The museum in Hallstatt displays the objects recovered from the ancient cemetery with which the archaeological study of Celtic culture began in the 19th century. The salt mine above the village still operates as a tourist attraction, its ancient tunnels still penetrating the mountain above the lake. To visit Hallstatt is to stand at the beginning of a story that ends, in some sense, in the Irish pub on your corner, the Welsh choir singing in a cathedral, the Breton bagpipe playing at a festival in Brittany, and the Halloween costume being assembled by a child who has no idea that what they are wearing connects them, across 2,500 years of history, to the world of Druids, warriors, and golden torques. The Celts gave Europe its soul before Rome gave it its structure, and both gifts are still present in everything the continent has become.